But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
President Kennedy at the time of that speech knew that we were far behind the Russians in space, but he believed that NASA could catch up. He stayed deeply involved with NASA in the early days. As you can see in this photograph, he is with the recently successful astronaut John Glenn checking out a capsule that he had recently flown in orbit. During a political visit to Dallas on November 22nd of 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. This ended his personal hope that he would live to see his dream of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade and his presidency fulfilled. What he missed by his death in the years to come was the Gemini program, where the U.S. astronauts started to catch up and exceed the Soviet Union in space. After the Russians succeeded again to beat the USA by having one of their cosmonauts exit the spacecraft in flight, a U.S. astronaut named Ed White followed soon afterwards with an even longer and safer spacewalk. Gemini 7 stayed in orbit for a record-breaking 14 days. And Gemini 6 became the first manned craft to rendezvous with a manned vehicle, Gemini 7. Gemini 8 practiced rendezvous again. This time, it successfully docked with an unmanned vehicle. Soon afterwards, they also showed the world that the crew and mission control could handle a life-threatening space crisis and still save the crew's lives. The rest of the Gemini missions continued with more rendezvous and more spacewalks, and in the end totally prepared NASA to launch for the moon and land there before the end of the decade. President Kennedy, by his death, missed his beloved NASA's Go Fever that resulted in the death of astronauts Grissom, White, and Chaffee in the Apollo 1 launch pad fire. He also missed the way that most on Capitol Hill picked up the pieces after these deaths and fixed the problems and still wanted to land men safely on the moon before the end of the 60s as a tribute to this fallen president's dream. He missed the determined and smart way that NASA got Apollo 7 off the ground in 1968. Then NASA boldly, by the end of 1968, sent Apollo 8 where no man, Russian or American, ever went before, to orbit 60 miles above the moon. The flights of Apollo 9 and 10 tested the Lunar Module Landing Vehicle system in Earth orbit and in lunar orbit, proving that all the systems were working as designed. And finally, with no more doubts or excuses, NASA sent Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the very surface of the moon, and they placed an American footprint on the moon on July 22nd, 1969, 5 months before the end of the decade, just as President Kennedy had boldly hoped for and so ordered. Apollo 12 repeated the feat in November of 1969 to conclude that decade of the 60s with 2 successful landings on the moon with no loss of lives. Apollo 13's near tragedy reminded NASA that this was still a very dangerous business. But showing that they had matured in this process, they found a way to save these 3 astronauts' lives and still make it look routine. Apollo 14, like Apollo 7 before it, got NASA back on track to landing men safely on the moon again. NASA had hoped to do this for many years to come, but Apollo 11's success, followed by the near tragedy of Apollo 13, started to shut down the free flow of government money at this time. By Apollo 15, even with their new lunar rover in tow, money for future space missions were over. NASA was only allowed to complete the missions already in progress, Apollo 16, and the last mission, Apollo 17. In all, NASA successfully and safely landed men on the moon 6 times. Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 14, Apollo 15, Apollo 16, and the last mission, Apollo 17. The great philosophical author Ayn Rand has a quote posted in Epcot Center, Walt Disney World. It reads, quote, "Throughout the centuries, there were men who took their first step down new roads armed with nothing but their own vision," unquote. 6 successful landings on the moon for this dead president's dream proves Ayn Rand's point perfectly. Some at NASA dreamed of creating a long-term moon base by using a modified lunar module that would provide at least a month of supplies for 2 astronauts that would land next to it with a second normal lunar module. They would stay on the moon and live and work there for a month, then they would use their lunar module to return home. While to NASA this seemed like the logical next step for it, the president's budget directors wanted NASA to find a way to lower the total cost of getting into space by developing a reusable space vehicle. NASA did come around to seeing that a reusable space vehicle might mean that space travel would soon become available to everyone, like airline travel was for everyone at this time. The projected price tag for this new development was so ambitious and large that the president's budget directors told NASA to go back to the drawing board and get a realistic, cost-effective idea for a reusable space shuttle. What NASA finally designed was a super large fuel tank that would be thrown away after each launch. 2 solid fuel boosters that would parachute return to the Earth in the ocean and be recovered and towed back to shore for reprocessing and refueling. While this was on paper reusable, the brand new solid rocket booster cost $10 million to build. The reused rocket still cost $5 million to refurbish and reuse by this recycling program. The space shuttle itself would be launched into space and used for up to 2 weeks on a mission. It would then re-enter the atmosphere and land like a flying glider, or more like a flying rock, onto a runway. On paper, it could be reused immediately for a new mission. In reality, it cost tens of millions of dollars to refurbish the shuttle for the next mission. It took 6 years for NASA to go from the working and mature Apollo program to finally build and fly the Space Shuttle Columbia in Earth orbit. During those 6 years, the Russians continued to fly their Soyuz space capsule on successful space missions, while NASA tested the engines and prepared the space shuttle to fly for the first time in Earth orbit. The Russians did not go to the moon in that time, but they did build 2 small temporary space stations and started the building of the world's first permanent space station, Mir, while NASA only returned to Earth orbit with the space shuttle. Since both countries were only going into low Earth orbit, you could clearly see that the Russians were once again in the lead in the world space race. Once the shuttle was fully tested and successfully launched, NASA tried to define its long-term missions. To make the space shuttle construction more cost-effective, a large part of the Air Force Space Command's funds were used to build the shuttle, so many of the early manned missions were to be secret military flights. Some of the early flights were also used to launch science missions to the planets Venus and Jupiter, as well as the first space telescope, Hubble. To defer some of the costs of each of these launches, many of these early flights also launched privately funded commercial satellites. And finally, it was still NASA's dream to show that the space shuttle might be the gateway for ordinary citizens to get into space. They did this by first flying a congressman and then a senator on some of the early missions. And then they launched a campaign to have a school teacher go on a space flight a short 5 years after the very first flight of Columbia. That flight was to be on the new shuttle Challenger, and the teacher named for that flight was Christy McAuliffe. On January 1986, we, her parents, and her students all saw the space shuttle explode a minute after it was launched, killing Christy McAuliffe and 6 other astronauts. This showed that the space shuttle was not as safe and mature a spacecraft as our previous Apollo and the Russians' Soyuz. That disaster grounded all the remaining space shuttles for the next 2 years. That grounded all the planned commercial satellite launches that had to go elsewhere to get into space, and all the secret Air Force flights that caused the military not to successfully protect our country during that time. Ultimately, the Air Force got the government to finance their own non-reusable rockets to support our needs for the secret space flights. All our scientific flights to the planet Venus, Jupiter, and the Space Telescope had to wait an additional 3 years to get back into the schedule to be launched. Once those scientific missions were successfully launched, and with the shuttle no longer being used for military or commercial missions, NASA allowed the shuttle to support the working Russian space station Mir. Finally, the United States got Russia and many of the wealthy nations to help NASA build the International Space Station as a replacement for the aging Mir station. This agreement committed the space shuttle to more than 30 flights to build this station, which, as it turned out, was the final mission for the space shuttle. The International Space Station took 13 years to build. Started in 1998, it was completed in 2011. The final price tag for the station was $150 billion, which the United States paid $100 billion in both module and shuttle mission costs. Fully operational, this platform can allow 6 astronauts to stay in Earth orbit and do debatably useful scientific projects at a great support cost of at least 2 to 3 manned Russian Soyuz crafts and at least 2 to 3 unmanned supply missions a year. In February of 2003, in a rare non-space station mission, the first shuttle, Columbia, was destroyed on re-entry, killing another 7 astronauts, and showing once again that the space shuttle was more dangerous than the spacecraft Apollo and Soyuz. In July of 2011, with the landing of the Space Shuttle Atlantis, the space program dreamed up by the late president was effectively over.